Welcome to Season 3, Episode 6 of the Database Podcast. I'm Dr. Molly Stewart, the Director of Research and Analytics Services at Education Analytics, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Vice President of Interoperability Solutions, Rosh Dhanawade. We work with school districts on interoperability and data quality using the EdFi data standard. And through this work, we've come to realize that there are at least 3 different languages being spoken by people working in this space: the language of databases and code, the language of teaching, learning, and educational leadership, and the language of research, including data science and statistics. This podcast aims to bridge the gaps among those 3 general areas because the more we understand how each group conceptualizes data-related topics, the more progress we can make towards solutions for educators and students that fully take advantage of best practices and cutting-edge knowledge in each of these fields of work.
And today we're excited to welcome our guest, Senior Research Analyst Kayla Bollinger. We are excited to talk about the topic of business rules. EA works at the intersection of research and data systems, and business rules come into play heavily in both sides of that work. And so thank you, Kayla, for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
So why don't you give us just a quick intro to your background and how you came to be in this line of work and then also at EA?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess I'll start back when I first got interested in analytics and working with data. So that was back in my undergraduate studies. I was studying physics at the time, but then I took an elective course in mathematical modeling, which I had a ton of fun in. I was having fun in physics too, but I really enjoyed being able to code. It felt very creative. And I was also really enjoying the math aspect of it, where you kind of abstract something that feels very hands-on and real, but abstract it so far that you can code it in a pretty simple way. So because I enjoyed that class so much, I decided to pursue my PhD in mathematics with an emphasis on machine learning. So just keep on coding and working on fun problems. And then when I finished my PhD, I was looking for a job where I could make a direct positive impact. And I got really lucky when I found EA. That's how I got here.
And then tell us about what your day-to-day entails as a senior research analyst.
Sure. Yeah. So we can have multiple analysis projects that we're working on at a time, definitely working with data directly, accessing warehouses, writing a ton of code, communicating with partners on what they want to see in their analysis or what they're hoping to learn. So I feel like we can do a lot of different things, which I really love.
So let's start with the basic question, which is just, what is a business rule and why is it important? And it's probably the foundation of all of your work, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think that's a great description of it. So I think of a business rule as a choice between a set of options that can impact an analysis, where all of those options are potentially valid. So you could imagine that for even a single analysis, there are many choices to be made, and so therefore many business rules to implement and keep track of. And some of those business rules can be critically important. So if it's written into law that you need to do a certain thing with your data, you have no choice, you have to do that. Other business rules can be important if only for the sake of reproducibility of your results or keeping your analysis consistent over time. So I think a good example of this would be, say you want to do a growth analysis, which measures how a school contributes to student growth over time as measured by their standardized test scores. And a critically important business rule for that analysis would be what students are going to be included in that analysis. Typically, those are students that are continuously enrolled. And then the choice comes from, how do you define what continuously enrolled means? So it could mean that the student is enrolled from the 45th day of school to the 160th day of school with no gaps in enrollment. Maybe it's from the 50th day to the 160th day. Maybe it's the 45th to the 160th with a single day gap. lots of different possible definitions to choose from. You have to choose one. In this case, the law is choosing for you, and so you go with that business rule. And then another example could be, since you have to work with test scores, sometimes students have multiple test scores for a single test, but you can only use one. So you have to make a choice of which score do you choose. Do you want to choose their score from their most recent attempt on the test? Do you want to take their highest score, maybe an average of all their scores? Whatever thing you decide to do, you have to only pick one. And it's good to be consistent with choices like that.
How do you document all of these choices in your work?
That's a great question, because since there are so many choices, just the sheer amount of them makes it challenging to document them. Typically, the first place we'll document them is directly in the code. So right where we make that choice, we're making it explicitly clear to any other analyst who wants to use that code or potentially reproduce the results. And then we try to translate that documentation into maybe a summary documentation that is more easily shared with our partners so that they know exactly what we're doing with their data.
How much of that in-code documentation do you then draw a line between here's the decision that we made and the choice that we were presented with, and like where that choice originated from? Like what's the trigger for that? Or is it just enough that as an analyst team, you just know the actual choice? Or is it important to know like the provenance of that choice?
It probably depends on the business rule. So if it's something like choosing a test score, maybe you choose the max test score, and everyone or every analyst that looks at that says, yeah, that makes sense to me. There's not like a whole lot of other options to choose from. If there's a more nuanced business rule or something perhaps more critically important, you usually leave a note of like where that decision was made. So maybe that could be some research specs that a research team has put together, or maybe that could be a message from a partner where they've told us the definition of something they want to use. So it could be a range depending on how critically important that business rule is or how unintuitive that business rule might be.
Sure. I mean, it seems like everything would be intuitive business rules that come from a partner that we're working with.
Sometimes the law is not intuitive.
That's what I was gonna ask next. Is like when you are interacting with policy and when you're interacting with, I'm assuming, legislative documentation, how do you like what's the skill set necessary to be able to get at, okay, here's the actual meat of what we're looking for rather than the language that surrounds it? Because that seems like a skill that is not like something you can just teach off the shelf, or maybe it is.
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that came to my mind was patience. So just having the time to sit down and maybe read the same thing 10 times to make sure you're understanding what's going on. And I think another big part is being able to communicate with our partners, because it might be difficult for us to understand because it might be our first time looking at that rule, but the partners we're working with, they've probably been looking at that rule for many years, and they could distill that information down to something that's more easily understood. So that's helpful too.
Do you actually go in and read the specific rules and regulations, like in addition to the law? Because I know a lot of the details are usually worked out in those rules documents. I have my background in legal education policy, so this is a really interesting intersection.
I think from my experience, I'm usually referencing documents that are like manuals. Accountability manuals is a typical document I'll reference. And also, again, just checking in with everyone else on my team and my partners to make sure I've covered everything I need to.
I would guess that the rules themselves are probably referenced in that document. So yes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
How do you deal with rules that shift over time? So let's say a rule is valid for this year, but then next year there's either federal or like state change. What's the process of saying that was true for this year and then this is true for this year, and then how does that affect downstream analysis?
So it can be tricky to keep track of them because the law could change and no one might tell me. So we just, knowing that that can happen, I do try to keep a really close eye on when these files could be updated. So there might be like a final version and a final version number 2, et cetera. And so I will keep referencing that document basically up and right until we have to deliver results, just to make sure nothing has changed unexpectedly. And we've looked into using tools that literally will compare 2 different PDF documents to each other just to like highlight, has anything changed in this document? Because there could be hundreds of pages to sift through. So that could be challenging in and of itself. And as far as adapting to those new changes, I think the best way we do that is by making our code as adaptable as possible. So if a change does come up, we can easily go in and find exactly where we implemented that rule and make that change there. So that's where the good documentation comes into play again.
Can you talk about what tooling you all currently use? So you're saying code, but what's the exact toolkit that we use internally? And then like what are the surrounding practices that you have around code management? That would be helpful for listeners to hear.
Yeah, so here at EA, we code in R primarily for analysis. We also use SQL when working with data, but typically all of our code will live in an R script. So ways we keep track of changes that we make, we use versioning, so we'll use Git and GitHub to keep track of changes. We also have standardized kind of formats that we all code in. So of course we're all coding in the same language, but then we also try to code in a similar style because we're all working on many different projects. And so if we all have a similar style, it makes it a lot easier to try to find the thing you're looking for. And we also try to break up our work into standard ways of like, step 1, clean your data. Step 2, bring it all together. Step 3, do the analysis. Like that's a very broad description, but we have like specific names for scripts and stuff that we try to stick with, and all that standardization really makes it easier to figure out what's going on in the code.
And just one follow-up for that, knowing your background that you shared earlier, when you transitioned into like from your PhD program into this work, did you have to learn R and like code check-ins all on the fly, or was that part of your graduate program? How did you actually like learn the skills that you just outlined?
So I had never coded in R before coming to EA, but I coded in Python. And I think for data science, it's pretty translatable between the two. So it was a really easy transition for me to code in R. And as far as trying to have good communication or documentation with code, that is a skill I developed more here at EA, but I also needed a little bit of that, if only to communicate to my future self what in the world I was trying to do at one point in time. So I had a little bit of that, but it's definitely, that skill has grown a lot since working here.
So I have a follow-up question from the change in business rules topic that we were referencing a minute ago. When those business rules change, and maybe statutorily or for some other reason, does that impact the validity of using like multiple years of data for a longitudinal analysis? Because that data would be slightly different, or for a longitudinal, and I guess you could go back to the raw data and run it with all the same business rules, but I'm guessing that wouldn't generally happen like in a state data set where you might be getting a state data set for each year.
Yeah, that is definitely one potential concern of having business rules changing over time. And that could be one reason why people really don't like to change business rules, because if there's not a compelling reason to, it's exactly what you said, Molly, you're just making it harder on yourself to compare across time. Some business rules can make such a small difference that maybe you wouldn't really see an impact. It's kind of hard to judge just how big of an impact it could make, but maybe if, back to the test score example, if you're picking their max score versus their most recent score, if so few students actually have multiple test records, maybe you won't really see a big impact. But if you're changing your rule for continuous enrollment or something big like that could really change who's going to be included. And so you do have to be aware of what were the business rules over time if you do want to be comparing results over time.
So at EA, we use both flat files and the Advice Stadium data, which is almost real time and updates with a very granular changes. So I think one interesting thing that has been coming up in like our conversations with the research group here at EA, as they have been learning more about how to use the data in that EdFi data warehouse, like helping people understand how to use business rules is, I think, really interesting and important. But also, do you ever have concern? I mean, anyone who uses a stadium data warehouse can use the data in that warehouse, and they may not be trained on how to use business rules. So what's the danger there, if there is one, of kind of giving that access to data without necessarily having it be analyzed or have business rules applied yet? And I know that we do apply some business rules like in our processing as it goes from the raw data into the warehouse portion. Although I could also say, Rosh, thinking back to our time at INsite, we didn't have a warehouse layer. So we were always looking at the raw data, and that was way more difficult than the data that we have accessible here at EA in the warehouse. So there's kind of a question in there, I think.
So I'm going to try to repeat your question. Was it to...
Good luck.
Do I have any concerns about or regarding business rules for users using a warehouse full of so much good EdFi data? Is that kind of what you're wondering?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can imagine a district user wanting to go in there and do a query and get all this data. But they may not know the exact business rules that need to be applied, just given their training or whatever reason. Many different people have access to the data warehouse. So I guess I'm interested to know, like, are there concerns with that? Like, we clearly wanted to train the research team on how the analyst team uses business rules because it's so important, but obviously we can't train everyone who would ever have access to that warehouse on kind of where to put those guardrails.
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly is a concern of a user coming in without a ton of experience with the warehouse and perhaps not fully understanding what that data is representing and using that in such a way, or using it incorrectly, I should say, because the understanding just isn't there. There are some ways to, I think, mitigate that concern. And one way, our data engineering team has written a lot of really great documentation for all of the data. Of course, there's a ton of data, so not everything is necessarily documented. But for the data that I believe they anticipate most users to want to have access to, that data is very well documented. So I think as long as that new user is taking a little bit of time to look at that documentation, we are sort of mitigating some of that concern of any misunderstandings in the data.
I'd be interested too for district users, their ability to go back and compare like what they see in other data reports, like from their student information system or from their vendor systems. They could maybe do some comparison just, at face value. Does this look like we're doing the right thing? But face value can also be misleading.
Yeah, and we do that. We do, for some metrics or data that we want to use, we'll share it with our partner and ask like, hey, is this what you're seeing? And we'll kind of learn a lot if we hear of any discrepancies that come up from that.
In your role, do you meet directly with partners and get that feedback or get those requirements? Or is there another layer between you and the partner?
Usually there's another layer. Sometimes it's direct.
Mm-hmm.
It really depends on the project.
Yeah.
I mean, related to this, there's like a couple questions that I have that are stirring up right now. One is just, what's the right division of labor between like self-service analytics? Because really on the EdFi side, we're trying to enable that, enable as many users in a district or an education organization to be able to run analytics themselves, and we're trying to scaffold that practice. But how much of that is like, do we curate something and then let them go wild on the curated portion? Do we allow them to maybe enter the same realm of work that you and your team does behind the scenes? Like, what is the right? Maybe right is the wrong question. Like, what are some possibilities of like where we're going with this technology, that things are more accessible now in terms of cloud-based data warehouses? We have ways for people to be able to look at the code that you're writing because it's publicly available, or available through code sharing. What is the right division of labor? And then I have a separate question that's like, okay, let's talk a little bit about AI and how that's maybe going to impact these things. But I think that first question leads to that second question, because it's like, do we want as EA to gatekeep? Should we? And then what could be the right like handoffs where we say, okay, this is now vetted enough for this person to use it?
There could be, maybe a tricky balance. I'm trying to think of the right thing to say here, but when you mentioned curating data or curating results, I think that is perhaps a big part of making data or being able to make analysis off of that data more accessible, is trying to make accessible what the partners want to see. So for example, if someone or partners are really interested in chronic absenteeism, like maybe we will make sure that data itself is sort of ready to go in the warehouse so that they can access it and they can answer whatever questions they want about chronic absenteeism, rather than having to first calculate anything like related to or apply any business rules about chronic absenteeism. They can just sort of take results that are already following those business rules and answer other questions they would like to. So I think of how do you distribute the task? Depending on how complex the analysis is, maybe that's how you want to distribute it. So as analysis becomes more and more complex, that is something that we as EA, we've got a lot of great analysts and researchers working here, and all people from all sorts of teams working to make those complicated analyses accessible to our partners. And some things that can be still very important, perhaps less complex, like looking at enrollment or something like this, maybe that could be something that a partner can look at directly on their own.
Yeah, and to introduce a little bit of AI stuff into this conversation, just for the algorithms, as I kind of think about it from my perspective within EA and the role that I play, I am increasingly becoming like hawkish about this particular topic, because it's, as there's this proliferation of tooling around data access and giving people either within a platform or within a tool that you attach, or exporting data sets into your chosen AI desktop utility, there's the risk surface starts to grow for like where analyses could lead to the wrong outcomes. And I think that's something that we as EA and people that are like-minded have a role to play in this marketplace, is to say, yes, you have these things that you're enabled to do, but here's all these things that, not to gatekeep, but here are the things that like that are risks. Are there places where, like, what is the right set of resources for people to engage in that conversation, knowing that they're not coming at it with the same body of work that somebody like you is, who has seen the impacts of maybe code being written in a particular way that ends up just slightly off, and then you have to go back and recalibrate it, or you find out some error that was done in the interpretation of the business rules. Like, all of these things have this magnified effect when you have somebody that doesn't have the same approach to data, but has the same accessibility that you do. Because in the past, it was much more difficult to run analyses on like big data sets, but that's becoming more and more and more accessible. So, what are some resources that people can engage in to kind of understand what the risks are, to balance it with the rewards of this enhanced tooling?
By resources, do you mean like what are some tools they can use?
I think tools, anything that's like helped you guide your thinking in this area, whether it's tools, it could be podcasts, books that you've read, like anything that has helped shaped your approach when you start looking at a particular problem or particular set of solutions that you have to come up with. Like, what goes into making up your risk analysis, your breakdown of data? Like, how do you get from, here's the problem that I'm trying to solve, to, I now have to navigate this maze of difficulties, and then I have to make sure as a researcher to hand off the right thing to the person in a way that somebody who's like writing a prompt in Claude or ChatGPT would need to know those same things. And it may not just be like one concentrated thing, but even if you have like some best practices or things that you incorporate as part of your workflows would be helpful here. Because honestly, I don't know if those things exist.
I think this is really related to what we talked about this morning with Rob Little, one of the data engineers, and he met with the research team and some of the analysts about he has been exploring the use of the LLM tools in Snowflake to help with SQL coding for folks who don't code in SQL all the time. I can see you shaking your head, Kayla, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that related to what Rosh has asked.
Yeah, I was also thinking about Rob's talk as well. I think a good rule of thumb for wondering if something like an LLM is safe to use for an analysis is the amount of critical thinking that you would have to use to do that analysis yourself. If there's almost, I'm a bit of a skeptic. If there's really any amount of critical thinking, I would be very hesitant to use an LLM, just because that is a really, really challenging thing. It's something that humans do very well, and something that LLMs really still can't do.
Could you give an example maybe of like a problem or question that would involve human critical thinking that you wouldn't use an LLM for, and then maybe on the other hand, something that you would feel comfortable using an LLM for?
Yeah, so I think the example that Rob gave about we have the research question, which of my eighth graders are on track to be proficient in math? First of all, that's a big question. So that's going to be a hard thing to get an answer from. And there are so many different things to consider going into that question, like what does it mean to be proficient? Things like that.
What does it mean to be on track?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the example that Rob shared, there's a couple different AI tools, and one of them did admit that it didn't know how to do that. And I thought that was great. That is one big danger I find with some of these AI tools. They sound very confident, and so it's very easy to believe them when they say things. But for an example that I would feel more comfortable using an LLM for could be maybe, there's so much data for you to sift through. You're just want to have some idea of what data to use. That would be a really good question. So maybe you could ask it, I'm interested in doing an analysis based on attendance. Where can I find attendance data in this warehouse? And so one great answer to that could be like, well, in this table, you have attendance related to courses. I see that it's not well populated. Maybe this other table that has daily attendance can help you because it is well populated. So now you've got a couple options of places to look. And then in addition to that, you have a little bit of insight into the data as well. That data might be not really available in one place, but more available in another. I think that could be a good use of an LLM.
It's almost like a smart search function.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, as opposed to an actual analysis function.
Yeah.
And maybe to connect the dots back to like where we jumped this conversation off is because like an LLM could look at your actual code if you're documenting it with all the logic that you've put into place, then that's even something. Would that be an acceptable workflow to say, like, can you highlight like where choices have been made in the code?
Yeah.
And so it's like more like workflow augmentation rather than workflow replacement, I think is like where I'm landing on, maybe a little bit less on the skeptic side of the spectrum and more of like I see just like twinkles of something. And I think that's where I'm personally landing on, is that I don't think we're going to replace maybe in some domains, I think in some sectors you will replace whole scale things, but in education in particular, we as EA need to like really get out in front and say, look for this to augment the things that you maybe spend a lot of time doing, or here's a way to shortcut from A to B, but it's not a shortcut from A to Z. And let's keep those things realistic, because I think as I have, even in just this year, gone to conferences, there's lots of conferences that like skirt around the depth of critical thinking that goes into analysis that you all do on data sets. And I think that is the real danger out there, because it's like the depth of work necessary is not being conveyed in those presentations, just being like a layer of varnish being put on to something that is actually truly challenging and requires a lot of deep thinking rather than a shortcut. There's no question in there. It's just a soapbox statement.
I definitely agree with everything you said, Rosh. And I also really like the example you shared at the beginning, where you could use it as like an augmentation of your work. Say, if you're trying to figure out where was a business rule applied, I think that's a great question to ask. And I think an example of maybe a bad version of that question would be, what are the business rules being applied in this code? Because that would be like, you don't want to get that wrong. The stakes are too high. But if you're just trying to get an idea of like, where is this thing happening? Because maybe it wasn't documented super clearly. It's sort of just guiding you, right? Because it says like, oh, I think it happened in this script. Well, you can go and look and find it. So I think there are safe questions and less safe questions for sure.
Sure. Yeah, that makes
like
sense.
questions that you can check to make sure they are correct answers versus answers that, I mean, you'd have to completely do the analysis to check if their analysis was correct, which in that case defeats the purpose of using the LLM.
Yeah, that's exactly right. At EA, we have this documentation software. So there's lots of different pages of documentation to sift through. And one of my go-to ways of interacting with that is it has an AI assistant. So I'll ask it a question, and then it'll give an answer. And at the bottom, it has a reference for what pages it built that answer off of. So I skip their answer and I just click on the page that it was referencing. So kind of like what I was saying before, it's a really good advanced search tool, but I don't take it at face value in its like summary answer.
Back when I was trying to figure out who would be the best interviewee for this session on business rules, and I asked one of your fellow analysts, and she sent me a resource that you had started compiling just about, I think it was just like a compendium of business rules. Can you tell us a little bit about, like, are there like ongoing, maybe partner agnostic resources that you are always thinking about updating or improving or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always trying to think of ways we can do our work more efficiently or more correctly. I'm wondering if the document that you were looking at was some automatically generated documentation of business rules, just because that was one challenge I've seen come up in multiple projects where you have a lot of code and a lot of business rules, and you want to be able to easily communicate that with your partner. But it's hard to keep track of, especially if they're changing over time. So I put together a script that basically sifted through all these other scripts. So a meta script, which then pulled out all the business rule documentation and brought it together. And I found that to be helpful just to kind of see it as one clear picture rather than a lot of little pictures spread throughout the code.
Something like that seems really critical when the whole point of business rules is to make sure that you're getting the right thing from your analysis. So if you don't have easy access to see what business rules are being put into play, then you can't make that judgment call.
Yeah, exactly. It also helps just if you're a new analyst on a project, you're wondering, like, what is this project about? Knowing the business rules is a great place to start, for sure.
So are there other things about business rules that we should have asked about or should be asking about, and we just didn't because we don't work with them every day necessarily, or at the level of granularity that you do? Anything else you'd like to mention?
I think we've touched on this, but the thing I did want to make sure was a takeaway from this podcast is how sneaky business rules can be, because they're really everywhere. Even while you're talking about working with our warehouse built off EdFi and how you had to use like raw EdFi data, even in the raw EdFi data, there's business rules being applied. And so you might think you have a handle on what's going on in the data because maybe you're very familiar with the warehouse, but then there's this whole other language. It's like, well, how did that raw data get to be?
There's a set of business rules happening in the API conversions and what is included in this, variable. It's not pulling in everything from the source system. It's making some decisions as well. Yeah. So there's like at least 3 layers of business rules that you're working with in the stadium warehouse.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I have any more questions at this point.
Right. This has been really awesome. Kayla, thank you so much. Not just for this podcast, but also for all of the presentations you've been helping me with to bring these ideas to folks who are just starting to get into the stadium data. I think it's crucial for the quality of our work, and um, and just hearing those detailed requirements, I think puts it in perspective. Like it's not just a clean data set that you can download from the government. They've done all the work already. Like we have to do a lot of the work. So there's a price, a trade-off for open access real-time data, and that is that we have to put in more of the work to make sure it is right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Rosh. Thank you. I should say thank you for Rosh's time. Rosh's time is the hardest time to get.
Ugh.
We already had to reschedule this once.
No, thank you, Kayla, for being flexible here. It's ridiculous sometimes.
Oh, no problem.
All right. Well, I look forward to publishing this. I think we're going to get a lot of great feedback from the listeners, both here at EA and elsewhere, especially because this is such a big need in EdFi, and I don't know how many people really are talking about this level. So really appreciate it. And yeah, look forward to continuing to learn from you about business rules in my day-to-day life.
I look forward to continuing working with you as well. So